Fresno, California, a city bustling with everyday life, unsuspecting of the dark secret hiding in plain sight. It was a quiet, unassuming neighborhood where people waved to their neighbors and watched their children play in the streets. But on a chilling afternoon in March of 2004, that calm was shattered by a sight the Fresno police would never forget. At 761 West Hammond Avenue stood a small, cluttered home, one that didn't seem like anything unusual to passersby. But as officers arrived, responding to what seemed like a routine custody dispute, they had no idea they were walking straight into a nightmare. A scene so gruesome, so unimaginable, it would haunt them long after the sun set over that quiet street. Officers approached cautiously, tension thick in the air. They could sense something was off, something lurking just beyond those walls. It was almost as if the house itself held a heavy, unspoken fear, a sinister presence that clung to the air. Inside, they would find evidence of a twisted life, a life bound by secrecy, control, and a disturbing devotion. What they discovered went beyond any crime scene they had encountered before. It wasn't just the presence of death that unsettled them. It was the story behind it, a story woven with control, manipulation, and a darkness that only one man could create. That man was Marcus Wesson. In the moments before they broke down the door, officers braced themselves. But no amount of training could prepare them for what awaited on the other side. 9 lives lost and the echoes of a cult-like control that stretched back years. This was more than just a tragedy. It was the end of a chilling, secret life that one man had forced upon those closest to him. But what drove Marcus Wesson to this horrifying act, and how did he manage to hide such darkness for so long? This is the story of the Wesson family, held captive by fear, controlled by one man's twisted beliefs. Prepare yourself, for the House of Secrets is about to be unlocked. To understand how one man could hold such power, we need to go back to the very beginning. Marcus DeLon Wesson was born on August 22, 1946, in Kansas. Growing up in a strict religious family, he was raised with the constant echo of Scripture and the sharp reminders of sin. His childhood was shadowed by control and isolation, as Marcus watched his mother enforce a rigid discipline, believing their family was chosen by God to be different. And, as Marcus grew older, he absorbed these teachings, adapting them, twisting them, until he was no longer the child shaped by faith, but a man bent on shaping faith to his own desires. As a young man, Marcus Wesson moved to California in the 1960s, drifting through odd jobs, building a presence that was quiet yet unsettling. He was soft-spoken, charming even, but something in his gaze held others at bay. Around this time, he became involved with a woman named Rosemary Solorio, a single mother with 8 children. Rosemary was older, a stabilizing figure, and in their early years together she could hardly have guessed at the man she was welcoming into her family. But soon, Wesson's need for control began to reveal itself. Marcus eventually shifted his attention to Rosemary's daughter, Elizabeth, a girl of just 8 years old. Elizabeth was still a child when Marcus, nearly 30 at the time, claimed she was the one chosen for him by God. Using religion as his weapon, Marcus manipulated Elizabeth's beliefs and molded her to his will. By the time she turned 14, he'd convinced her to marry him in a makeshift ceremony, tying her to a life she'd had no choice in. And so the cycle began. A cycle that would extend far beyond anything Elizabeth could have imagined. Marcus Wesson was now the head of his own family, a family that would grow in the most horrific ways. Over the years, Elizabeth bore him 9 children. But to Marcus, children were not seen as individuals with rights or dreams of their own. They were his property, an extension of himself. He was their father, their teacher, and ultimately, their God. He used homeschooling to shield them from outside influences, feeding them his own interpretations of religious texts. Under his roof, they learned about obedience, purity, and the sacrifice they would one day be called to make. His rules were strict, his teachings even stricter, and punishment was swift for anyone who dared to question his authority. As his children grew, Marcus's rules became even more extreme. He kept the family isolated, forbidden from making friends or even acknowledging outsiders. He drilled into their minds that the world outside was evil, tainted, a place they were not meant to belong. To Marcus, his family was a sacred unit, cut off from a corrupt world he saw as morally decayed. This was his kingdom, where his word was law. And like a king, he controlled every aspect of their lives, even down to how they dressed, how they spoke, and how they behaved. But the most chilling aspect of Marcus Wesson's control was his twisted belief system. One he crafted himself by cherry-picking elements from Christianity, but with a perverse twist. He claimed that Jesus was a vampire, a figure that Marcus said he was chosen to emulate. In his warped mind, Marcus Wesson began to view himself as a Christ-like figure, ordained to lead his family to salvation, no matter the cost. He warned them that the end of days was near, and when it came, he would be the one to guide them into eternity. This wasn't a teaching of love or redemption, it was a doctrine of fear and absolute control. His children were taught to believe in him as their savior, but only on his terms. As the years went on, the family continued to grow. But this wasn't a normal growth by any measure. Marcus fathered more children, not just with Elizabeth, but also with his own daughters and nieces. One by one, he groomed them, isolated them, until they became his victims, conditioned to accept that they were his to claim. In his mind, he was building a family in the truest sense, bound not by love, but by a perverse and twisted control that reached beyond bloodlines. Outside of his family, Marcus Wesson remained an enigmatic figure. To those few who met him, he was seen as quiet, perhaps a little strange, but no one could have guessed the horror he held behind closed doors. Neighbors sometimes heard muffled arguments, but with his family hidden away and his manner reserved, people rarely thought twice. He moved often, each new house filled with his growing number of children, yet hidden from prying eyes. It was as if he existed on the edges of society, seen yet invisible, carrying out a sinister vision that only he understood. Marcus Wesson's vision was no longer just about control. It was about domination, submission, and absolute authority. His family became his followers, his personal congregation, where he preached fear and damnation as he saw fit. To them, he was the center of the universe, and they were bound to him in ways that were far beyond the reaches of love, far beyond choice. For Marcus Wesson, the family wasn't just his blood. It was his creation, molded to serve his every whim and bound to his word alone. This was the rise of Marcus Wesson, a man who saw himself as more than a father, more than a husband. He saw himself as a god, standing at the center of a twisted kingdom where his word was law and his family his subjects. But little did he know, the walls he built to contain his dark world would one day collapse, exposing the monster he had become to a world that was unprepared for the horror within. Under the roof of Marcus Wesson's home, there existed a world that most could never imagine. A world where love was twisted into submission, and where fear took on a life of its own. To the outside world, the Wesson family appeared almost invisible, moving from place to place, living in squalor and silence. But behind the closed doors of every home they occupied, Marcus Wesson was creating his own kingdom, a kingdom ruled by his vision, his authority, and his iron grip over the minds and bodies of those closest to him. Wesson's family was not just bonded by blood, they were bound by the dark, suffocating force of his control. He kept his children isolated from society, homeschooling them and crafting a reality that was entirely his own. There were no friends, no outside influences, no voices but his to guide them. He taught them that the outside world was dangerous, sinful, and corrupt, a place where people were condemned by their own free will, and he was the only one who could save them. His teachings were rooted in his twisted version of Christianity, but he had his own interpretations, his own dogmas, and above all his own hierarchy, at the top of which stood himself. In his mind, Marcus was a figure of divine power. He taught his family that he was chosen by God, a prophet in his own right, who held the keys to salvation. Jesus, he said, was a vampire, and they, too, were descendants of this ancient, holy bloodline. He claimed that eternal life awaited them if they stayed faithful to his word. Through fear, he manipulated and molded his children, indoctrinating them with a belief system that left no room for doubt, no space for rebellion. Wesson's rules were severe. His children had strict schedules, dictated down to the hour, and punishments for disobedience were brutal and swift. If they dared to question his teachings, they were met with a rage that was as calculated as it was terrifying. Physical punishment, isolation, and relentless verbal abuse became the tools he used to break their spirits, instilling obedience through pain and fear. And as their spirits broke, Wesson filled the cracks with his own beliefs, binding them to him with a psychological grip that became harder to escape as the years passed. But Marcus Wesson's control didn't stop at the mind. It extended into every corner of their lives. His daughters and nieces were not just his children, they were his wives, a title he claimed was divinely sanctioned. He told them they were chosen for him, that God himself had ordained this arrangement. Under the guise of a twisted holy union, he manipulated them into relationships that defied both law and nature. One by one, these young women became his victims, groomed from childhood to accept his dominance and coerced into relationships that no child should ever endure. The family grew, but each new child born into this house was merely another soul under his control. Wesson indoctrinated them from infancy, introducing them to his twisted version of the world, keeping them locked away from any sense of normalcy, any understanding of life beyond his rules. They learned quickly that he was their authority, their protector, and in their eyes he was also their only path to redemption. His control over them was absolute, almost cult-like, with rules that mirrored those of the most extreme sects. He kept them in cramped, filthy spaces, often without electricity or running water. And as their isolation grew, so did his power. Cut off from the outside world, his children and wives had nowhere to turn, no one to tell them that what was happening was wrong. To them, this was life. This was all they knew. In their world, Marcus Wesson was the center of everything, and his words were taken as truth. He crafted stories of an impending apocalypse, a vision of a world that would end in flames, and he told them that when that day came, only he could save them. But to reach salvation, they would need to prove their loyalty, and their sacrifices would have to be complete. Wesson convinced them that their ultimate act of faith would be to die together, to transcend the mortal world and ascend as a family bound for eternity. He planted seeds of fear and devotion, watering them with false prophecies until his children could no longer tell the difference between love and control, faith and fear. Marcus presented himself as a savior. His teachings weren't requests, they were commandments. His voice wasn't gentle, it was absolute. And his power wasn't based on respect, it was built on terror. Every action, every word, every glance held meaning, and his family had learned to read them all, to obey them all, without question. If they disobeyed, they faced consequences that went beyond pain, beyond isolation. They faced the risk of losing their only chance at salvation, and for them, that was a risk they couldn't afford to take. As the years passed, the family continued to grow, and with each child born, the cycle of control and indoctrination only deepened. Marcus Wesson became not just a father, but a figure of fear, a man whose very presence cast a shadow over every part of their lives. His children, his victims, lived each day in a prison without walls, bound by rules that twisted love into suffering and faith into blind submission. But for Marcus, it wasn't enough to control their bodies. He needed to possess their very souls. He needed them to believe with every fiber of their being that he was their savior, that he held their fates in his hands. And as he molded them, year by year, heartbreak by heartbreak, he created a family that was nothing short of a captive congregation. A cult held hostage by a single man's will. A family held captive not by chains or walls, but by one man's darkness, by one man's insatiable need for control. And while they may have seemed united on the outside behind closed doors, they were a family on the brink. A family bound by fear, bound by silence, and bound by a loyalty that would one day prove to be their undoing. March 12, 2004. It started as an ordinary day in Fresno, California, but by the time the sun set, the lives of those in a quiet neighborhood on West Hammond Avenue would be forever scarred. No one knew that this day would bring to light the horrifying reality that had been festering behind the closed doors of Marcus Wesson's home. A tragic sequence of events would unfold, exposing a darkness that no one could have imagined. It began with a confrontation. Two women, previously part of the Wesson family, arrived at the small, cluttered home that Marcus and his family now occupied. These women were his nieces, and they had come with a single purpose: to take back their children, the offspring Wesson had fathered with them. For years, they had been trapped under his control, isolated and manipulated, forced into a reality that was as inescapable as it was horrifying. But on this day, they gathered the strength to defy him, to reclaim the children who had been used as tools in Wesson's twisted world. As the women approached the house, their faces were etched with a mix of fear and determination. They had made a choice to face the man who had controlled every aspect of their lives, to demand the return of their children, the children who had known nothing but captivity under his rule. Their voices rose in confrontation, shouts filled the air, and soon, neighbors gathered to watch the tense standoff. No one understood the full depth of what was unfolding, but they sensed that something was terribly wrong. Within minutes, the Fresno Police Department arrived on the scene, responding to what they thought was a routine custody dispute. Officers approached the house cautiously, unaware of the horror that waited inside. As they moved closer, Marcus Wesson appeared at the doorway, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the porch. He was calm, eerily composed, as he told officers that everything was fine, that they should leave. But the women, standing nearby, were frantic, pleading for the safety of their children, begging the police not to leave them in that house. The officers, sensing the mounting tension and realizing the situation was far from ordinary, decided to remain. They attempted to negotiate with Wesson to convince him to release the children peacefully. But Wesson's demeanor shifted. He grew agitated, his voice tense as he argued with the officers and his nieces. The police watched as his control, once so absolute, began to crack under the pressure of his relatives' defiance. And then, in a chilling moment that would later haunt those present, Marcus Wesson stepped back into the house and closed the door. Time slowed as the officers stood outside, helpless, unsure of what was unfolding within those walls. The moments ticked by, agonizingly slow as a heavy silence settled over the scene. Then, out of nowhere, a single gunshot shattered the air, followed by another and another. Neighbors gasped, the officers froze, and the mothers outside collapsed into cries of terror, realizing that the children they had come to save were in imminent danger. The officers rushed forward, pounding on the door, shouting Wesson's name, demanding that he open up. But all they received in response was silence. When they finally breached the door, nothing could have prepared them for the sight that awaited inside. As the officers moved deeper into Marcus Wesson's home, the silence that filled the house was unnerving, as if the very walls were holding their breath, concealing the horrors they had witnessed. What they were about to uncover would haunt them forever. Each step forward felt like stepping into a dark void, a space heavy with secrets too sinister to imagine. In the dim light, their eyes adjusted to the scene before them, and what they found was unlike anything they had ever encountered. The house was a labyrinth of clutter, with every room packed from floor to ceiling with boxes, garbage, and discarded items, making it difficult to navigate. It was clear that this home, if one could even call it that, was a place of isolation, a prison Marcus Wesson had crafted for those under his control. But as they reached the back of the house, in a small, cramped room, the true horror was revealed. As they moved further in, the smell of blood hit them, a heavy, metallic scent that filled the air, thick with the weight of tragedy. In a back room, they found a scene that would forever remain etched in their minds. The bodies of 9 people, including 7 children, lay in a pile, each one carefully arranged in what appeared to be a ritualistic manner. Each victim had been shot through the eye, a chilling detail that suggested not just murder, but a carefully planned execution. The room was filled with antique coffins stacked against the walls, a grim collection that Wesson had amassed over the years, symbols of his obsession with death and control. In the midst of the carnage, the officers spotted Wesson's altar, a crude, makeshift shrine where he had kept his twisted interpretation of the Bible, filled with his own handwritten notes. Pages were littered with cryptic messages, verses twisted and reshaped to fit his own dark vision. To Wesson, these words were sacred, a justification for the nightmare he had inflicted upon his family. He had convinced them that they were part of a divine plan, a plan that required their obedience, their loyalty, and ultimately their lives. Amidst this sea of horror, Marcus Wesson stood, blood staining his clothes, his expression disturbingly calm. He didn't resist as the officers took him into custody, didn't utter a word of remorse or explanation. He simply watched as his world, this empire of darkness he had crafted over decades, crumbled around him. His calm was unnerving, a stark contrast to the cries of anguish from the mothers outside, who had come to reclaim their children, only to find themselves robbed of any chance to save them. The youngest of the victims was just 1 year old, a child who had known nothing but the walls of this prison, who had never seen the world beyond Wesson's control. And yet, even this innocent life was not spared. To Marcus Wesson, each life taken was part of a twisted legacy, a step toward the eternity he believed awaited them all. And as the officers looked down at the lifeless bodies before them, they were faced with the devastating truth of his absolute control, a control that had ultimately led to this unthinkable tragedy. Among the scattered belongings, they found drawings, children's toys, small remnants of the lives that had been lost. These remnants, so ordinary, so tragically out of place, served as silent witnesses to the innocence that had been stolen. In one corner, a child's drawing, bright with color, lay crumpled amid the debris, a fleeting reminder of the lives that had been extinguished, lives that had known only the shadow of one man's madness. As the officers gathered evidence, taking photographs, collecting samples, documenting the scene, the weight of what they had uncovered began to sink in. The house on West Hammond Avenue was more than just a crime scene. It was a mausoleum, a final resting place for the souls Marcus Wesson had trapped within his twisted world. The horror of what they had uncovered was difficult to process, and for many it would take years to come to terms with what they had seen that day. As officers led him away, the reality of what had occurred began to settle over the scene. Wesson had made good on the twisted promise he'd instilled in his children, a promise that their ultimate act of loyalty would come in the form of a final, irrevocable sacrifice. In his mind, he had delivered them from a world he believed was beyond redemption. To the police and neighbors, however, it was nothing short of a massacre, a brutal, horrifying display of control, taken to its most violent end. News of the crime spread quickly, sending shockwaves through Fresno and beyond. People struggled to comprehend the depth of Wesson's actions, to understand how one man could wield such absolute power over his family. Reporters flocked to the scene, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that seemed too horrific to be true. But as the details emerged, as the dark history of Marcus West's control and abuse came to light, the world was forced to confront the horrifying reality of what had been hiding behind that door. That day became a defining moment in the lives of everyone touched by the Wesson family tragedy. For the mothers who had come to reclaim their children, it was the day they lost everything. For the police officers and neighbors, it was a day that shattered their sense of safety, a reminder that monsters can hide in plain sight. And for Marcus Wesson, it was the day his kingdom of fear and darkness finally fell. A day when the truth, long buried beneath layers of secrecy and control, was exposed for all to see. But as Wesson was taken away, the question lingered. What could drive a man to such unimaginable cruelty? How could one man command such absolute control over the minds and bodies of those he claimed to love? These were the questions that would haunt investigators, the public, and the survivors alike, as they tried to make sense of a crime that defied all understanding. In the aftermath, the house on West Hammond Avenue would stand as a silent witness, a grim monument to the lives lost and the horrors endured. It was here, within these walls, that Marcus Wesson had turned his family into captives, stripped of their will, bound to his twisted vision. And it was here, on that day in March, that the darkness he had cultivated was finally brought to light. After the bodies were discovered, and Marcus Wesson was taken into custody, the investigation into his life and crimes began. But as detectives peeled back the layers, they realized that what they were dealing with was not just a case of murder. It was the story of a man who had orchestrated a life of unimaginable control, abuse, and manipulation over decades. Every new revelation uncovered painted a darker, more complex picture of Wesson, a man who had created a kingdom within his own home, where he reigned through fear, coercion, and psychological domination. The first part of the investigation was to understand how Wesson's control had been so absolute. Investigators learned that he had isolated his family almost completely from the outside world. His children were rarely, if ever, allowed to go to school, visit friends, or interact with anyone outside their immediate family. He homeschooled them, not with a curriculum, but with a doctrine of his own twisted beliefs. Wesson's teachings were filled with warnings of damnation and promises of salvation, creating a psychological prison where his word was law. As they delved deeper, detectives uncovered details of Wesson's distorted religious teachings. He claimed to be a prophet, chosen by God to lead his family to salvation. Investigators found that he had cherry-picked passages from the Bible, rewriting them to suit his own ideas. In his teachings, Wesson presented himself as a Christ-like figure, twisting the concept of faith into something that demanded total obedience, even at the cost of one's life. His family lived in fear of an apocalyptic vision he preached, a vision where they would be called upon to prove their loyalty in the ultimate act of sacrifice. But Wesson's delusions went further. He believed that Jesus was a vampire, and that his family, too, had this holy lineage. He used this bizarre belief to reinforce his control, telling his children that they were special, chosen, and bound to him through divine blood. Investigators found writings in his home detailing these beliefs, pages filled with his interpretations, handwritten notes that left a chilling insight into the mind of a man who had turned faith into fanaticism. Interviews with surviving family members provided even deeper insight. The investigators learned that Wesson's manipulation extended beyond mental and emotional control. He had turned his daughters and nieces into victims of a cycle of abuse that began when they were children. For years, Wesson groomed his daughters and nieces, conditioning them to accept relationships that no child should ever have to endure. Through coercion, isolation, and the constant reinforcement of his twisted teachings, he convinced them that they were destined to bear his children, that this was their purpose and their duty. As the investigators pieced together this network of abuse, they were struck by the sheer scale of Wesson's manipulation. He had fathered children with his own daughters and nieces, binding them not only through blood, but through the doctrine of fear he preached. To Wesson, these children were not individuals with their own lives and identities. They were symbols, extensions of himself, part of a legacy he intended to carry forward. Each child was born into this dark world, raised to see Wesson as their savior and protector, unaware of any life beyond the walls of their home. Through interviews, the detectives also learned of Wesson's rigid and brutal rules. His children were forbidden to laugh, to smile, or to engage in any behavior he deemed inappropriate. They were not allowed to interact with the world outside or even to acknowledge people if they passed by on the street. Wesson's punishments for breaking these rules were harsh, ranging from physical beatings to extended periods of isolation. This constant reinforcement of fear kept them under his control, making escape or resistance almost unthinkable. As the investigation continued, a profile of Marcus Wesson emerged, a man who had taken every opportunity to assert his dominance, using religion as a tool to manipulate and isolate, creating a world where he alone held power. Detectives examined his financial records and found that Wesson had managed to live off government assistance, welfare payments that he collected from his many children. He maintained a life of poverty and isolation, moving his family from place to place, often living in squalor, yet keeping his beliefs and rules intact. His control was not just physical but psychological, financial, and spiritual, a web so complex that it had ensnared every member of his family. But the most haunting detail of all was Wesson's ultimate doctrine, the concept of a family sacrifice. Interviews with survivors revealed that he had spoken to his children about the need to die together, to escape the evils of the outside world and ascend together into eternity. In Wesson's mind, this act would be their final proof of loyalty, the ultimate sacrifice that would free them from the world he saw as corrupt and sinful. And on March 12, 2004, he had brought that twisted vision to life in the most horrifying way. For the detectives working the case, the scale of Wesson's manipulation, the depth of his control, was staggering. They had encountered cases of abuse before, but nothing like this. Here was a man who had not only violated the trust of his family, but had built an entire belief system around his abuse, using it to keep his victims bound to him even in death. It was a level of control that went beyond any normal understanding of power, one that left a mark not only on the lives of those he had taken, but on every officer, investigator, and member of the community who had to confront this chilling reality. As Wesson awaited trial, the evidence continued to mount, a horrifying account of a life built on manipulation, coercion, and unrelenting control. Investigators had revealed the monster behind the man, a man who had taken advantage of faith, innocence, and loyalty to fulfill a vision that could only end in tragedy. And for the community of Fresno, the knowledge that this horror had been hiding among them for years was a revelation that would never be forgotten. In June of 2005, Marcus Wesson stood trial for one of the most shocking and disturbing cases in California's history. His face was expressionless as he entered the courtroom, showing no sign of remorse or guilt. To the public, Wesson was already a monster, a man who had shattered the lives of his own family members and built a world of fear and manipulation. But as the trial unfolded, the full extent of his twisted control over his family would be laid bare, revealing a depth of cruelty that was difficult to comprehend. The prosecution's case was clear and uncompromising. They painted Marcus Wesson as a man who'd created a cult within his own family, one that revolved around him as a self-proclaimed prophet. Wesson had instilled in his family an apocalyptic vision, a belief that they would one day be called upon to sacrifice themselves to prove their loyalty to him and his twisted ideology. For the jurors, these details were almost surreal, a story that seemed like it belonged in a nightmare rather than reality. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented Wesson's own writings, his rewritten biblical passages filled with twisted messages about obedience, purity, and sacrifice. They shared details of his belief that he was the father of a sacred bloodline, a lineage he claimed to have created with his own daughters and nieces. Jurors were shown photographs of the crime scene, images of the bodies carefully arranged, each one bearing the single gunshot to the eye, a final mark of Wesson's control. These images, haunting and brutal, left a profound impact on the courtroom, a stark reminder of the lives taken under his influence. Survivors took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted years of manipulation, fear, and abuse. They spoke of a life where every action was monitored, every thought dictated by Wesson's teachings. These testimonies gave jurors a glimpse into the mental and emotional chains Wesson had forged, chains that had bound his family so completely that escape seemed impossible. As each story unfolded, the extent of Wesson's control became clearer, a control that had not just violated the physical safety of his family, but had destroyed their very sense of self. The defense, however, attempted to shift the blame. They argued that Wesson had not pulled the trigger, suggesting instead that one of the children might have carried out the act in a misguided attempt to fulfill his teachings. But this claim, this suggestion, that a child had been responsible only served to underscore the depth of Wesson's influence. Here was a man who had instilled such fear, such blind loyalty that his own children would even consider taking the lives of their siblings as an act of devotion. The defense's argument only deepened the horror, reinforcing the power Wesson had held over his family. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, heavy with the weight of tragedy. Family members sat in the gallery, their faces etched with grief and anger, unable to comprehend how the man they had once looked up to as a father figure had turned into something so monstrous. The jurors themselves were visibly shaken, forced to listen to accounts of abuse, manipulation, and indoctrination that stretched over decades. It was not just the loss of life they were confronted with, but the complete destruction of innocence, of family bonds that had been corrupted by one man's delusions. As the trial progressed, the prosecution continued to dismantle any remaining facade of innocence. They presented witness after witness, each one adding another layer to the case, another piece of evidence showing Wesson's absolute control over his family. Psychologists testified about the nature of cult dynamics, explaining how Wesson's isolation tactics, his use of religious justification, and his unyielding rules had turned his family into captives of his ideology. This was not simply a crime. It was a life sentence of psychological imprisonment that had only ended in the most tragic of ways. Finally, after weeks of testimony, the case was handed over to the jury. The jurors deliberated for days, wrestling with the gravity of the charges, the lives that had been lost, and the depths of Wesson's control. And then, in June of 2005, the verdict was read. Marcus Wesson was found guilty on all counts: 9 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of sexual abuse. The courtroom was silent, the weight of justice finally settling over the room, a moment of closure for a community still reeling from the horrors that had been uncovered. Wesson sat motionless as the verdict was read, his face betraying no emotion, as if even this moment of reckoning could not break the mask he had maintained for so long. He showed no remorse, no sign of regret, and as he was led away, those who had witnessed the trial were left with a sense of both relief and sadness. Relief that justice had been served, but sadness for the lives that had been forever altered by his actions. In the sentencing phase, the jury had one final decision to make: whether Wesson would receive the death penalty or life in prison. After hearing from more family members, survivors, and experts, the jury ultimately chose the death penalty. Marcus Wesson would be sent to California's death row, where he would spend the rest of his days in a prison cell, a far cry from the kingdom of fear he had created within his own home. For the survivors, the verdict marked a turning point, a chance to rebuild, to reclaim their lives after years of darkness. But the scars remained, reminders of the years lost, of the innocence stolen by the man who should have protected them. And for the community of Fresno, the trial served as a warning, a painful reminder of the dangers of unchecked control, of the horrors that can hide in plain sight. Marcus Wesson had faced justice, but the echoes of his actions would linger long after the trial ended. His legacy would be remembered not as a prophet or a leader, but as a cautionary tale, a story of a man who had twisted love into terror, faith into fear, and family into a nightmare. The trial of Marcus Wesson may have ended, but the impact of his actions continues to linger, casting a shadow over the lives of those who survived and the community that bore witness to such horror. For the people of Fresno, the memories of that day in March 2004 are still vivid, a reminder that monsters sometimes hide in plain sight, behind closed doors, masked by a semblance of normalcy. Those who escaped Wesson's control carry scars both visible and unseen, haunted by years of psychological imprisonment and loss. Many of them are still piecing together lives they never had the chance to fully live, striving to reclaim their identities, their autonomy, and their hope. The courage it took to come forward, to speak the truth in court, has become a testament to their resilience. They have shown that, despite the horrors they endured, the human spirit can survive even the darkest of nightmares. In Fresno, the legacy of this case has left its mark on the community. Neighbors who once only saw glimpses of the Wesson family's isolation have wrestled with feelings of disbelief, guilt, and sorrow, asking themselves if more could have been done. The tragedy has become a catalyst for awareness, a stark reminder of the need to remain vigilant, to look beyond the surface, and to intervene when signs of abuse or control appear. Marcus Wesson's story serves as a cautionary tale, one that exposes the extreme dangers of unchecked control, isolation, and the abuse of power under the guise of faith. His twisted manipulation, the indoctrination he forced upon his family, has left a permanent scar, a reminder that the power to do harm is often wielded by those closest to us. But in the wake of his actions, there is also a message of resilience, that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there is hope for healing, for justice, and for rebuilding. And as we reflect on the tragic story of the Wesson family, we're reminded of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the power of truth to dismantle even the most insidious forms of evil. This is a story we tell not to instill fear, but to encourage awareness, to remember those who suffered, and to honor the resilience of those who survived. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to light, to share the untold truths, and to remember those whose voices were silenced. Thank you for watching.